Well, I was a fan of the art, and I was kind of, I guess what happened was I was kind of upset that this art would never show in a museum or in normal galleries. And at the time, I took a trip up to Jim Brucker's and saw his huge collection. And at the time, I wasn't familiar with Von Dutch. And when I saw this stuff about Von Dutch, and I didn't even know about it because I knew about Roth and Williams and things like that. But to know that Von Dutch, was almost forgotten by, these new generations that came up, I just felt it would be really good to try to get him in a museum. So I sort of worked behind the scenes because I was on the board of Laguna Art Museum to convince them to show Von Dutch, Roth, and Williams in that show. So I got the director and the curator, and I took him up to Brucker's because he had this whole display of all this stuff. And so that got them kind of interested in it. And then once finally they decided, okay, we're going to do this show, but then I somehow became in charge of raising all the funds to do this show. And once all that was in place, then the curators, which was Craig, Stesic, and Bolton, and the other people in the museum, they were able to do this show and do it in a museum way that finally got all this art, the museum world attention, and cataloging that show. I can't quite remember, but maybe at least 1 year, but maybe 2 years. Probably 1991. I also remember that show, then it traveled to Seattle, and it also traveled to Baltimore, Maryland, to this place called Coca in Seattle. And Coca, Center on Contemporary Art, and something like Mica or something in Baltimore. And I also helped get those venues because somehow I knew people in those kind of museums that were into it, where the museum had trouble. Like in the normal museum world, those channels didn't work. It didn't work. So I also helped get it travel to Seattle and the East Coast. That sort of came as they were putting the show together. Maybe it started out as a working title, and it just became the title. And that was Susan Anderson, who was a curator working on the show. I think she came up with that term. Yeah, and actually, she's back there working now on the Rick Griffin show as sort of the museum organizer for the show. She's married to Bolton Colburn, who's the director of Laguna Art Museum now. But at the time, back at Custom Culture, he was just like a curator. She mostly worked at Laguna Art Museum. When they came up with that title, then I just remembered that she came up with the title.
So. Just like this, or?
You do research of it, it just seemed like probably the obvious title or the apparent title, but she's the one that came up with it and started calling it that. And I don't think she had too much of a hot rod background. It was just the curator's point of view of like synthesizing.